Now let's talk about air conditioning fundamentals. When it comes to the fundamentals being a little bit different things to several different people. You had 10 people lined up in a row and you ask them what the fundamentals of our industry is, and you may get 10 different answers, or you may get several of them that are very similar but slightly off by a little bit. I would like to say that after 20 years as a service technician, and after traveling around the country as an instructor, that my core values, my fundamentals in this industry are not different than anybody else's. I'm a service technician. I'm a contractor. I'm also a license holder. So I see the day-to-day things in the industry, and I have for years and decades. So as we talk about fundamentals, realize that my fundamentals may be slightly different than yours, but we both have the same goal in mind. And if we break it right down to it, even though they might be a little bit different, I would say they have similarities. Now, with that being said, there's a difference between fundamentals and core values, and oftentimes that's brought up during these classes. Now, in my opinion, the fundamentals of the industry can be summed up in a fairly short segment. But when you go beyond the fundamentals into the core values, into what's important, which I believe is not only making sure that you're following EPA guidelines, safety requirements, company requirements, manufacturer requirements, using best practices while you're in the industry, and then also doing your charging procedures and things like that. Beyond that, it's taking care of the customer. It's taking care of the person that's paying you to be there, and sometimes we lose sight of that. Oftentimes, we go through these busy spells where we go out to a customer's house and it's the same type of call that we've had 5 other times that day, especially during service and check times of the year for places that have high amounts of seasonal change. So you've got winters and summers, and during those times you're doing heating and cooling service and checks, and they can get pretty unbearable. You do 4, 5, 6, 7 of those a day. I guarantee that by the time Friday rolls around, your service and check isn't nearly the same at the end of the day on Friday as it was first thing in the morning on Monday. Now, the problem with that is, by the time that Friday one rolls around, we may be shortcutting things. We may have gone the week and done things here and there that were on our service form, that were fundamental to the service and check. We check our voltages and our amp draws and our temperature readouts, our blower readings, our charges, all of those things. And by the time Friday rolls around, you've weeded out the things that in your own assumption really don't help the customer or help the piece of equipment. They're more the cover your butt types of things that really may not be proactive, and they may not help you diagnose things, but they're done as more of a concession in the industry. You leave those things out. Well, now why would you leave those things out? Well, if they feel like a waste of time, why were they in there in the first place? Well, your company has a reason for all of that stuff being in there. And it's not the customer that's late on Friday's fault that you've already done 25 other service and checks that week. It's not their fault. You've done it 25 times and you're probably sick of it, but for them, you've only been there once. And because you've only been there once, it's special to them. They need to see the value that you can offer them during those checks, during those service calls, during those installations. So don't shortchange the customer and make them lose some of the value of you being there because you've been so busy lately. That is part of a fundamental value that I have, taking care of that customer, making sure that we go beyond what the industry standard is, which is following the manufacturer guidelines. Right? We want to make sure that we set up the blower properly, that we've got a good temperature drop, that we make sure that we got plenty of return air, that we explain filters and how those are working, and any kinds of suggestions for changes that they may have to their existing system. Those things are all important fundamental values that surround the customer. And to me, dealing with the customer and making sure that they understand things as well as I can possibly explain them is a core value, because without the customer, we've got no business. We're in the customer-oriented business. So when we're looking at fundamentals, realize that by the time this is all said and done, we will be going beyond those basic fundamental guidelines that traditionally are talked about in courses like this. Now, how did we get here is a pretty a pretty standard question that we get. You know, how in the world did we ever get to the point where we're using 410A? How in the world did we ever get to the point where we're phasing out R22 as a refrigerant? Why would we do that? Well, if you're asking those questions, the answers can come from knowing the history of the industry. So we will talk a little bit about the history of the industry, because if you don't understand that, then you may not understand how we got to where we are as an industry, and you certainly won't be able to forecast where we're going. And some of you may be thinking to yourself, well, who cares? I'm not going to forecast that. I don't have a crystal ball. I get that. I understand that mentality. We've all gone through that. But if you don't know where the industry is going, you can't properly educate yourself. And if you can't properly educate yourself, well, we've all seen what happens to those people. Some of you were around when the big transition from R22 to 410A took place. There were a lot of individuals that really did not jump on board with 410A. It had high pressures, it used special gauges, it used a different oil, it was a two-part blend. They just simply refused to use it. And because they refused to use it, guess what? They refused to get proper training on how to use it, because they weren't intending to ever jump on that bandwagon. Well, I got news for you. Being on this side of the table and the training side, and being on the other side of the table during those times as a service technician, I can assure you that the best training that you will get on anything is the training that comes out when it's brand new. That's when people are excited about it and they're scared at the same time. Now, how does that dictate anything? Well, when you're excited about it, as an engineer, as a manufacturer, as a vendor, as a rep, as a coworker, you're talking about it all the time. It's on the topic of all kinds of water cooler talks. But in the same breath, you're also scared about it. You go to these training classes, you ask the questions about things that freak you out or scare you, and they get answered. That's where a lot of the value of early on training comes into play. So let's move on. Let's talk a little bit about the history of the industry, more particularly the refrigerant families, so that we can look at that transition, figure out how we got to where we're going, and then we're going to talk also a little bit about where we're going in the future, as well as where we are right now. And we're going to correlate that all together, not just with the transition of refrigerants, but we're also going to look at the phase-out schedule as well, so that we can understand why they're doing things the way that they're doing them. Looking at the common refrigerant families, it helps us to move forward from where we are if we understand where we started from. It also helps us how we got to understand how we got to where we are. I mean, be quite honest with you, I've asked myself several times, why are we using 410A right now? Why are we using this retrofit refrigerant over that retrofit refrigerant? What, how did we get to that point? And I have to reflect through the industry's history in order to get some of those answers. And of course, that's what we're going to talk about right now. And so, looking at these families, the first one being CFCs. And the most common CFC is R12. Now, R12 and this whole family has been phased out since the end of 1995. And that phase out should have taught us a lesson because it was very painful. You see, R12 was the most widely used refrigerant in automotive and in refrigeration. And when the impending phase out was coming, guys would say, oh, they can't do that. We use way too much of this stuff to be able to phase it out. And they were wrong. See, but their wrong mentality kept them from getting the proper training to use this stuff. And because they didn't get the proper training then, a lot of those guys really had some painful lessons to learn in the future. And they also gave a lot of pain to their customers. So let's talk about that for a second. Back in the mid-90s, actually the late 90s, if you had a car that had R12 and it maybe had some leaks or some issues, after the phase out of R12, the price went through the roof. So it wasn't really cost effective to continue recharging it with R12 and replacing the R12 components and things like that. So oftentimes people would get a retrofit. Well, the retrofit for R12 back then was R134A, which is in cars currently on a wide scale. Well, one of the main complaints was after I got my car retrofitted with R12, it never worked right again. Well, why would that be? And part of that was because people never got the proper training. Not everybody, but enough that it caused pain in the industry. See, the proper retrofit for R12 in a car would have included replacing the compressor, flushing the existing lines, replacing the seals, replacing the metering devices, things of that nature. If you were to do that and then retrofit it to 134A, the system would have worked just fine. It would have been seamless. It would have cooled the passengers just like the R12 did. Unfortunately, instead of doing that, what people would do is they would remove the existing R12 and just put R134A back in with no retrofitting procedures done, and then it never worked right again. So you're asking yourself right now, who cares? I don't work on cars. I don't work on refrigeration maybe. So what do I care about this stuff? What has ripple effects right now? If you go out to a customer's house and they have an older R22 unit, well, R22 is going through the same pains as R12 did. The price is expensive. It's getting more and more scarce. So customers are contemplating, do I get new equipment? Do I retrofit? Give me some advice. And if you suggest retrofit, sometimes they fall back on that fear, maybe it'll never cool right again. And depending on how you do that retrofit, it might not ever cool right again. So it's beneficial for you to understand where the industry was because those ripple effects are still there. Those pains are still there in a lot of our customers. So it's important for you to understand how to explain the difference between the way that it was done during that retrofit and the way you're going to do it, which is using best practices, the flushing, the replacement of metering devices if necessary. All of those types of things make a huge difference in making concessions to the customers on whether or not they should go through with a retro. Now the Hcfcs have been the most widely used refrigerant in the light commercial and residential market for decades. And they are currently under a phase out of their own. It started prior to 2010, but really wasn't a big sect. It was only 141B that started its phase out in 2004, so it didn't affect a lot of us, so we didn't notice it. But in 2010, we definitely noticed. In 2010, the Hcfcs hit the phase out at 75% reduction, at least that was what was slated, and not to mention it also was the time in which the newly produced equipment with pre-charged R22 inside of it was also ceased in production. Now, they continued producing dry R22 units. They just didn't charge them with fresh virgin R22 after that date. Now, that's a tough one. Because at that time, refrigerant actually didn't go up too much in price. It wasn't until there were some buying allocations and things like that that the refrigerant actually went up in price. But we've got the impending fruition of this phase out on the schedule in 2020. So once 2020 rolls around, us common contractors are no longer going to be able to buy newly produced or imported R22 for the long term. That's when it stops being produced. So whatever's left is left. That's what we have access to. Well, at this point, we're not even there yet, but the price is through the roof. We're talking several $100s for a chemical that used to be less than $1 per pound for this stuff. So already people are looking to you for retrofit ideas, and the EPA has 70 some examples of refrigerant that could go back into the existing R22 unit as a retrofit with no extensive replacement of components. So the opportunity is there, but you have to use best practices so you get it right the first time. If you don't get it right the first time, then it's going to cost some money either for you or for the customer, and there's going to be some pain involved. Now the Hcfcs slotted for phase out have been under replacement for decades now. The Hcfcs have been replaced primarily by the Hfcs, just like their former refrigerants, the CFCs. Right? So what's replacing R22? Well, 410's been in that market for decades. What replaced the R12? Well, 134A. Both of those refrigerants are Hfcs. Now, what's the difference between the Hfcs and the two refrigerant families we just talked about before them? Well, the two refrigerant families before them had a high ozone depleting potential. That was why we originally had the Section 608 Clean Air Act refrigerant handling license in the first place. Now, the difference is Hfcs have a zero ozone depletion potential, but they do have a high global warming potential, so that should help you realize that's not the end of the game, right? That next generation, our children, look at the environmental impact of global warming as huge. And so they're constantly pushing the envelope on efficiency, but also the environmental concerns. How can we make things run better, but how can we also treat the environment a little bit better so that our children down the road have something sustainable that they're going to be able to use. So now the Hfcs themselves, although they have replaced the former two families, they're not the end of the road either. Because of their high global warming impact, they're slated for what's called a phase down, which is a little bit different. A phase down, as you might guess, means they're going to reduce the production down to a certain point, and then they're going to taper it off, which that's changed a couple of times, so I hesitate to even mention what that production level is, and it's so far down the road that it's really not all that important right now, except for the fact that their replacement refrigerants are already here. Those are the HFOs. Now, the olefins have been around for a short time here in America, and the olefins are huge on the environmental impact list, right? As far as the reduction of the environmental impact, more specifically. I'll give you an idea of what we're talking about here. HFO 1234YF is the replacement for HFC 134A. Now, what's the difference between those two? Well, efficiency-wise, there's not much difference. But the difference comes from what happens to the refrigerant once it gets in the atmosphere. Whether it's by accident or mistake, we're not talking about that right now. It doesn't make any difference. It still acts the same in the atmosphere, right? So once it gets into the atmosphere, the HFCs, or the 134A, is going to stay there for somewhere around 13 years. whereas its replacement, the 1234YF from the HFO family, is going to be there for 3 to 10 days. Now that is a huge reduction on environmental impact and global warming over the long haul. So look for the HFOs to make their mark over the long haul, more and more and more. And look for the decrease in the Hfcs, even though those are the retrofit for much of the Hcfc family because of that environmental impact. So here you look at the original phase-out schedule for the Hcfcs, which is like R22, and you can see that it is really pretty straightforward, right? 2004 it actually started, but it didn't affect everybody because it was a very specific refrigerant, 141B, and that was not a real large part of the industry. So most people, when they talk about the Hcfc phase out, they're referring to 2010 when it impacted the most people. And if you look at this, the cutback in refrigerant was 75% of production. So what does that actually mean? 75% of what? If you're going to reduce by a certain percentage, you have to know what you started with. Well, that percentage, the 100% bowl that they're taking from, was actually in the early 2000s. It was over a 3-year period of the early 2000s, and it included the Hcfcs and the Hfcs alike. Now, why would it include both of those into that bowl since we're only talking about the phase out of one of them? Well, because that was a huge transitional period. And in order to figure out what the total usage would be, you have to take into consideration that a lot of the refrigerant that would normally have been used was transitioned to a new family. And so that whole production value was combined to give you your 100%. So 2010, it was cut back by 75%. And even at that 75%, it was fairly painful. There wasn't a huge impact on the price at that point, but the phase out also included a complete cease of production of the equipment that used R22 as well, as far as the pre-charged equipment. Now the dry units, is what they called them, were produced long after that, and they are no longer produced now, but for several years beyond that 2010 date, the dry 22 units being produced lent somebody to purchase a dry 22 unit and then charge it with R22 out in the field or with a retrofit refrigerant. So they were useful in either direction. In 2015, there was a fairly significant turnaround in how much that production value would be cut back at 90%. And of course, at 90% cutback, the assumption was, you're 5 years into the phase out. At that point, how many people are actually going to be using the R22 equipment anymore, and how many would be wanting to continue use of the old stuff if you had a catastrophic failure? And so there really wouldn't be the same need to have a lot of that refrigerant produced. So the cutback was fairly heavy, and of course in 2020, that's when the phase out becomes complete for most of us. Now I call it complete for most of us because, as you can see by the phase out chart here, it actually shows you a small amount of that phase out is going to continue beyond the 2020 date, but that's for a small sect of the manufacturing and industrial industry that have refrigeration systems that are large enough that they would not be able to comply within the time frame that they are given. And so they're given a license to utilize the R22 beyond that 2020 date. But for us common folks, us common contractors, installers, servicemen, it's going to be gone for us in 2020. And the closer we get to that date, the more price dictates what we're actually doing. So it's important for you to realize that it's coming, for one, and two, something's going to be replacing the R22. What is it, and where do you get the training for that, and why is that even valuable? So moving forward, we're going to look at one more small section of this phase out. right here in the public charts. Okay, this is off of EPA.gov. You can find this information at EPA.gov, keyword search, Section 608, Clean Air Act. Okay, and on the left-hand side here, you've got production allowances. Okay, those are mandates. Those are placed there, and those are a fact. Okay, so you can see that it's changed a little bit from what the phase-out schedule originally was telling us. It said in 2015, for instance, it was going to cut back by 75% or by 90%, whereas on this chart, we still have 21.7% on our allowance, which puts us clear back in the 79% area instead of the 90% cutback area. And it's going to continue that way through the rest of the phase out at that 21.7. Now, why is that? Well, without getting into the particulars, there was litigation, there was a buying allocation, 2 buying allocations in that time frame between 2010 and 2015. And the settlement basically said, we overproduced because of this, and then we underproduced because of that. Going through the rest of the phase out, we're going to produce a stable amount because, if you'll look in the right-hand chart, the right hand is consumption allowances. The consumption allowances are going to be getting less and less and less and less. And the further you get in the phase out, the less equipment is available, the less refrigerant is available, and the price goes up. And so because of those factors, you're going to have companies that are no longer selling or working on the R22 equipment. And so they're going to dictate to their customers that, hey, we're not recommending that you go with R22 equipment anymore, or R22 refrigerant anymore as a leak, repair, and replace type of thing is much more suitable. And whether or not they go with an HFC, that's a retrofitting refrigerant, or they go with something else. In the future, we're going to be looking at HFOs and things of that nature. Makes no difference. The idea is you've got a higher allowance on the left for production, but you've got a lower consumption on the right. So the higher allowance on the left really is kind of a moot point.